In the early 1990s, I lived for a little more than a year on the island of Rotuma, which is a Polynesian island about 400 kilometers north of Fiji and to the west of Samoa. And while I was there, I was studying a wide range of traditional uses of plants, learning about the flora and how people manage their landscapes. And as part of this, I conducted a survey of the healers of the island. One of the things that I learned throughout that survey period was that there were kind of two fundamental types of healers that could be recognized in the community. And since then, after talking with a number of other ethnobotanists who have worked in many other parts of the world, I've come to realize that this categorization of two general types of healers seems to be pretty wide and common. It's hard to find a culture that doesn't seem to have both of these. The two kinds of healers that we tend to find around the world can be labeled as being shaman and herbalists. Generally, the shaman are oftentimes male. They are frequently self-taught. They're heavily dependent upon spiritual aspects of healing, and sometimes that's the sole focus of what they do, is the spiritual aspects, and they don't necessarily use plants or other things. This doesn't say that all shaman exclude the use of plants, but there's a fair number who are that way. And they may think of plants in very different ways than healers do, even within their own society. The second category is that of herbalists, or in some countries these are referred to as leaf doctors. More often than not, these are female. They're trained by a relative or some other family member, and they're heavily dependent upon plant medicines and oftentimes also physical therapies such as massage. They use spiritual components as part of their healing tradition, such as prayer, but these are not typically used to the exclusion of other kinds of remedies such as plants. Now, this generalization is kind of important. One of the secondary features of it is that frequently the individuals who are shaman are professional healers. They earn their living as a healer, and they oftentimes will have a spiritual role. And in fact, in some communities, they may be the local religious leaders. Whereas the herbalists or leaf doctors very rarely are professional healers. And in fact, they serve other kinds of roles. They may be farmers, or they may be housewives. They may be all kinds of things in society, but they probably are not a professional healer. And in fact, more often than not, there isn't really a formal payment for their services, and so they couldn't really earn a living as a healer. And so these two really stand juxtaposed. And I think it's particularly interesting when you think about this in light of much of modern medicine, where we have kind of professional healers who are paid, and where they would fit into this, this dichotomy of shaman versus herbalists. Rotuma actually consists of one larger island that's surrounded by 7 smaller islands as kind of an island group, each of these being volcanic peaks. The land is quite rich as far as the soil goes, with a lush flora. This is tropical. It's just a little ways south of the equator. And this is kind of everything you would expect of a tropical island, particularly one that is in a humid and moist region. The Rotuman people themselves are Polynesians. They consider themselves to be related to Tongans, Samoans, and Uveans. They have a chiefly structure with clan authorities. So the island, the main island is divided into 7 districts, and each of these districts has a high chief and various sub-chiefs, and each of those chiefs is appointed out of their family clan. and this is not necessarily an inherited title as it is in some other parts of Polynesia. They practice both a matrilineal and patrilineal land tenure system, meaning that inheritance of both land rights and rights to different resources comes through both your mother and your father. And they primarily depend upon growing root crops from the land, such as taro and pit taro and sweet potatoes and yams, and then fish from the ocean. And together that comprises the bulk of their diet, along with the more traditional Polynesian staples as well. Rotuma has connections with Melanesian and Micronesian communities as well. They happen to be at kind of the intersection between what is usually labeled as Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. Although these are artificial lines and names, they do kind of represent functional groups of people who carry on different traditions of living. And in Rotuma we find elements of each of these. These include the fact that Rotumans use most of the crops that are of atolls, such as Micronesians would use, and they have a history of contacts with the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Marshall Islands, and Kosarai to the extreme north. Because Rotuma is a relatively isolated island, its flora is somewhat limited. There's only about 600 species of plants found in the islands, at least from my surveys, about half of which are probably native species, including ancient introductions and plants that got themselves there, both indigenous and endemic species. The flora is actually more diverse than that of the Hawaiian Islands, but it's less rich in endemism. So what I mean by that is that there's a wider range of kinds of plants present, but there's fewer that are unique to the islands of Rotuma. So in the early 90s, I began to conduct a survey of the traditional medicinal system. I began my survey by traveling around the island. It turns out that the island has a single road that goes completely around the edge of it, and virtually every family lives somewhere along that road. So if you start at any one point along the road and work your way around the island, given enough time, you can actually encounter almost everybody in the culture. So myself and a woman I was working with began to travel around the island, and we would, as we encountered people, we would ask them if they were a healer or if they knew somebody who was a healer. And we would ask them, if you were in need of health care, who would you go see? And people would respond and they would give us a name of somebody, and we would record that. And sometimes they'd give us the names of several people. As we worked our way around the island, we started compiling a list of names, and it turned out that there were a few individuals out of the 2,500 people on the island who were constantly being named. And clearly these were people who were well-known healers, were well-known for their healthcare practices, and because of this, were clearly having an impact on the local healthcare system. Now at the same time, we had a few people who said, oh, well, I'm a healer and I would heal myself. But absolutely no one else named them as a healer. So it was hard to say whether these people really were healers or not, but we decided that anyone who was not named by at least two people other than themselves, we weren't going to count as being a healer, because it was fairly obvious that they weren't really having much of an impact on the local healthcare system. Otherwise people would have known about them and named them. Once we had completed our list, we then began at the top of the list with the person who had been named the most and began to conduct formal interviews with them, going down the list until we got to people that had only been named by 2 or 3 people. So as we went and met with each healer, we would proceed through a fairly orderly process of learning. However, because answering a questionnaire and this kind of thing is not really normal behavior for people in a community, we would frequently kind of break out of the formal system, and it would become more of a teacher and apprentice, where the healer was the teacher and I was trying to learn as best I could what it was that they had to offer. So the interviews ranged from just a few hours with some healers to more than a week with some, where I would spend every day, 12 hours a day with them, learning more and more and more. With each healer, we would try to learn the kinds of diseases that they treated, the treatment methods that they used, and then the specifics of the remedies that were used. We used what's referred to as a participant observation method, which this means that we would not just ask what are the ingredients of a remedy, but we would say, okay, can we actually sit down and make this remedy? And then we would go through the process, and I would try to make the remedy myself in order to prove that I really had learned the process. In some cases this was quite time consuming, but by doing it this way, a lot of times you learned fine details and subtle nuances that just would not have come out otherwise. At the end of this, we prepared voucher specimens that represented each plant remedy that was discussed. And so what this means is we made dried plant material that we deposited into the herbarium in Fiji as evidence of the information that we learned. The reason for doing this is that as we publish scientific papers and as people from the community in the future try to use the information that we provided, they can then go to those samples and look at them and see which plant species we were talking about. This is a much better way than just writing down the names that are given, because sometimes names can refer to multiple plant species or multiple plant parts, or in some events people actually forget a name over time, and if you didn't have a specimen of it, then nobody will know exactly what plant you were talking about into the future. And this is one of the things we were thinking about is, how will this information be useful to people in the future? So these are images of some of the healers who I interviewed, and it kind of gives an idea of the range of healers in Rotuma. The first woman you see here is a school teacher, and the plant that she's holding is a plant that she uses to treat burns. She was really happy to talk about this, and she wanted to share the information about it because she thought it was really important that people be able to treat burns and treat them appropriately. And she was really upset that she knew of some people who had scars from burns and they hadn't used this plant, and she thought it was just wrong that they had avoided its usage. And this is a characteristic of many of these healers, is they want people to be healthy. They're actually more concerned about people's health than they are concerned about property rights and such things. And so I found the healers that I worked with in Rotuma to be very open and very sharing. At the same time, sometimes they would share remedies with me when I was alone that they wouldn't share with me when I was with other members of the community. And there's a simple reason for this. Within Rotuman society, if an individual learns a remedy, they also take on a responsibility to use that remedy appropriately. If they use that remedy inappropriately, then the person who taught them that may suffer some kind of repercussion for it. It may be that the person becomes sick. And so it's really important that if you teach somebody a remedy, that you be certain that they're going to use it appropriately. And so you're kind of careful who you teach in your own community. Now in the case of teaching me, they were fairly confident that I was never going to use any of these remedies. Not only had I told them that I wasn't, but they knew that I was going to go home and wouldn't really have access to most of the plants, and they also knew that I was unlikely to see the diseases that they were diagnosing. So there were lots of good reasons why they could share with me, as a foreigner, things that were they had to be a little more careful with sharing in their own community. This may seem kind of odd, but this is actually a situation others have found in other communities as well. This gentleman was the highest ranking chief in the island of Rotuma while I was working there. He was the chief of the district of Itutiu. His name is Ngangach, and he happened to be a healer as well. And what this illustrates is that it turns out that it does not really matter what rank in society you hold. You can still be a healer and still be called upon to practice a healing tradition. The third healer shown here practices a tradition that is largely spiritual in nature. She only uses a few plants, but she clearly is a traditional healer as recognized by Rotumans. In her case, she treats a series of diseases that are not really recognized by modern medicine, and yet are serious issues within the Rotuman community. Most of these dealing with relationships amongst people, and how to address issues in communities that live in very small areas. The fourth healer illustrated is actually a lay Methodist minister. And this represents kind of another aspect of Rotuman traditional medicine, which is that there is a strong spiritual element within it. Now, Rotuman healers are mostly either Methodists or Catholics. I didn't find any that professed anything else, but within this, they practice a mixture of clearly old beliefs and kind of modern beliefs. And so they will talk about God at some time, and at other times they'll talk about their ancestors and other spirits that are around them all the time. And so there's a mix of traditional perspectives on spirituality and introduced Christian perspectives on spirituality. And this flows through most Rotuman medicinal treatments. Throughout the survey, we were identifying diseases, and we were trying to identify every disease that was recognized within the entire society. This is not an easy task. It turns out there's lots of different kinds of diseases that people recognize, and there's subtle differences. There may be varieties of diseases that people will recognize and have treatments for, or in some cases not have treatments, and recognize that when that disease happens, you're just a goner, or you just have to deal with it. As we encountered different diseases, we started to see some patterns. There were certain diseases that were almost always treated with home remedies, and there were other diseases that were almost always treated by professional healers. In some cases, the diseases that were treated by professional healers were not really diagnosable by the average person, meaning that a non-healer wouldn't necessarily know how to diagnose that disease. All they knew was that somebody was sick. In other cases, there were fairly easily diagnosed diseases that were that anybody could figure out, but that were only treated by professional healers. For each disease, we tried to determine the causative factors, and it may seem kind of obvious. I mean, if somebody's got a broken bone, you may say, well, they broke their bone, they fell, or they did something to break it. But it turns out that the logic and the understanding of disease causation within Rotuma is more complex than that. It's more complex than just the obvious. So although it's possible for somebody to fall and break their arm, more often than not, something like a broken arm is the result of some deeper cause. Maybe they were distracted by a spirit that was being mean to them, and then they tripped and broke their arm. And so it's that spirit that needs to be dealt with. Maybe there's something else going on in their life that caused that accident to occur. It's very rare that something is just simply an accident. People don't just get colds because they're around other people with colds. In fact, there may be some very profound reasons as to why people become ill. And these require fairly profound treatments. And this is part of the reason why traditional healers are oftentimes sought for different kinds of diseases. Some of the causes that people cited for diseases occurring included natural events. This could be, a coconut falls on your head. It could be spiritual disruptions or inequities that are occurring. Could be family disputes, weather. We do this oftentimes in our society where we'll say somebody has a cold and therefore they're sick. Sorcerers or enemies. This was oftentimes named as a cause of illness, and yet throughout the period of time I was there, I never worked with a healer who claimed that she had recently treated somebody who had been ill because of an enemy or a sorcerer. Unclean living and eating dirty foods or bad foods was quite often cited as the cause of different illnesses. And in fact, I would say this was one of the major causes of illness from a Rotuman perspective. Also, kind of some difficult to describe causes, such as longing for something. If you really wish for something, or if you're deeply in love with someone and yet you just can't have them, or a kind of a malaise or depression that comes over people at certain times of the year or at certain ages. all of these were kinds of causes of illness that are recognized by Rotumans. Within the Rotuman treatment system, there were three kind of large categories that are recognized. Macho refers to somebody who builds up, who constructs something. The same word might be used to describe a carpenter in the community, or somebody who builds buildings. I loosely interpret this to be obstetrics. Most of the treatment remedies that fall under the category of macho involve either delivery of children, or the health of very young children, or the menstrual cycles of women. The second category is masse. These healers, or these kinds of treatments, deal primarily with different spiritual illnesses. The third kind is sarau, which refers to almost any kind of massage. Sarau itself is a word that basically means to massage. However, many kinds of remedies that were labeled as sarau didn't necessarily involve physical massage, and instead the healers would discuss it as being a spiritual kind of massage of the person. And so you can see that we've got three big categories. They each have a clear meaning to Rotumans, but this does not translate very well into English. Just as in any society, Rotuman healers and members of the Rotuman community at large have certain perspectives of what an effective remedy is. Within an effective treatment in Rotuman tradition, social and spiritual matters are settled first. And in fact, this is oftentimes recognized as the most important issue, dealing with the social structure first, getting all of the issues taken care of so that people in the community are happy with one another. Next is massage or some other kind of physical therapy. Although this isn't always used, it's often used. Third is that there may be plants that are applied externally or taken internally. This is very, very common that a remedy has plants in it. Fourth is that there's some kind of dietary or movement restrictions that are applied. In many cases, a healer will tell a patient that they not only can't eat certain foods, but they may say that they must eat certain kinds of foods. So the restriction can be positive as well as negative. The same is the case for movement. A person may be told that they cannot go to their farmlands, or they may be told that they need to go 3 times a day to the beach or something and sun themselves. Restrictions can be positive and negative in both cases. As far as the delivery of an effective treatment, Rotumans are just like other people around the world, where they have expectations of how a treatment is effectively delivered. The first is that an effective treatment needs to be conducted by a culturally accepted healer. Not just any old person is an appropriate deliverer of health care. It needs to be the person who the society has decided is appropriate and acceptable. A second is it's conducted on neutral or familial lands. And what I mean by this is within the Rotuman clan system, there is power associated with house sites and with certain pieces of land, and this power is tightly linked with your clan or lineage. And so any Rotuman has affiliations with their mother's clan and their father's clan, and so does land. Land has affiliations, and so if you're going to be effectively treated, you need to be treated on a piece of land where you have the right familial connections. The same is true of a healer. A healer has a set of familial connections, and the spiritual power of their ancestors flows through them as one of the key elements of any particular treatment. And so the healer needs to be treating people within a location that is appropriate for their spiritual power as well. The combination of these two sometimes means that some healers cannot treat some patients, and so a patient may have to seek a different healer in order to be treated. In other cases, it may mean that the patient and healer are able to together bring about a very powerful treatment because the way that the two of them converge. Third, an effective treatment is accomplished in a predetermined time sequence. So if a healer says that a patient should be completely healed within 3 days or within so many treatments, that is what is expected. If the patient is not adequately healed within that designated time period and is not completely better, then it's determined that the entire treatment was a failure and that either there was a misdiagnosis or that something else has gone wrong. One of the two didn't follow the rules. Either the healer didn't follow the rules or the patient didn't follow the rules. And fourth, any particular treatment that is effective must be followed by some kind of ceremonial offering at the end. In many cases, this means that the patient simply gives the healer a meal or some other small gift. But in some cases where the healer has accomplished a rather large task and the patient has overcome something that might have been life-threatening, then the healer may be given a much greater gift. Now, the healers are very, very careful when we talk about this to point out that money in Rotuma is never an acceptable gift as payment. And in fact, the healers are very afraid of receiving money because they have the general belief that if you receive payment for healing someone, that you will lose your power to heal. So they're, pretty careful not to accept cash for that. And instead, usually they're accepting standardized gifts of chickens or other kinds of foods. Rotuman treatment applications are applied in a large number of ways. Most of them, though, are applied topically, which means on the surface of the skin. This includes the usage of massage. The applications may be simple, meaning that whatever the remedy is just wiped on and left. It may be massaged into the skin, or it may involve moxibustion. In the case of moxibustion, a small amount of the remedy is placed on the skin and then is ignited and allowed to burn on the surface of the skin. This is a type of treatment that used to be practiced all over Polynesia. Missionaries weren't very happy about the idea, and so in most parts of Polynesia it has disappeared. But it still is occasionally practiced on Rotuma. The next most commonly used treatment application is ingestion, where somebody will drink an infusion of a remedy. Sometimes a remedy may only involve a spiritual application, meaning that the patient is treated with a remedy. So there could be some plants that are extracted, and then this is applied to either their aura or some other spiritual aspect. Maybe if I give an example, it'll be a little more clear. One healer I worked with, each time she would treat a patient, she would arrange in advance a certain time that the patient would come out of his house and sit in front of his house and face in the direction where she was living. She would come out of her house and face in the direction of where he was living. They might be a couple of miles apart, but at the preset time they would each face in the right direction, and for a period of time she would chant and motion towards his direction. She would then prepare a remedy in front of her and apply the remedy to him from a distance. And this was considered to be a spiritual application of the remedy. Most of the remedies involve a combination, so it may be applied topically, it may be ingested, and there may be a spiritual component, such as prayer. The remedies can involve plants or not involve plants. However, it turns out that most of the remedies that I learned about did involve the usage of several plants in each one. There's a number of different kinds of treatment specialties. This list shows some examples of these. Most of the specialties involve topical treatments, and so here's a list of kind of the primary healing specialties that were encountered other than those that are topical. Notice that the listing at the bottom is one that we might not think of as a treatment specialty in most parts of the United States, and this is a specialist who treats in the removal of fish bones. The reason for this specialty is that much of the traditional diet consists of small reef fish. As you eat these, you consume the bones as well as the meat of the fish. And in most cases you actually eat everything, including the guts of the fish as well. And in the process, every once in a while, a bone will become lodged in the throat, maybe going crosswise or something, but it's a very painful event. So because of this, Rotumans have a treatment specialty. They have healers who this is their expertise, is what to do about those bones that are lodged in the throat. And it's a fairly complex set of treatments. These are not just simple things. Patients who have a bone lodged in the throat may go to great effort to find a healer who is appropriately trained to deal with a fish bone caught in the throat. Rotuman healers can be divided into those who are specialists and those who are generalists. So the specialists will treat certain kinds of ailment categories, so they'll follow some of these treatment categories I've been talking about. Whereas the generalists will treat kind of a wide range of ailments and will not necessarily be limited to a treatment category. So within our survey, we identified quite a number of healers who practice certain kinds of specialties. Now, sometimes a healer would be a generalist, but would also have a few specialties as well. And what we did was we tried to organize all of this data in order to understand better what the role of specialties was within the society and which specialties seemed to be in greatest demand, or at least were most available. What we found was that of the healers surveyed, 49 of them who were healers who had one specialty that they practiced, and that was it. 14 practiced 2 treatment specialties, all the way down to where we had one healer who had 33 different treatment specialties that she used. This was highly unusual, as you can see from this list. When we next looked at the age distribution of the healers, what we found was that of the 70 healers that we interviewed, out of total population of 2,500 people, 49 of them were female, so 82% of the healers were female, overwhelmingly female. Only 18% were male, and in fact of these, most of these only had a few specialties, these men, and when they did have a specialty, it was of being a bone setter, and bone setting clearly requires a little bit more strength, and so men tended to be bone setters more often than women. When we look at the age distribution of the healers, we can see that they're largely on the upper side of the age. The average age of the healers we interviewed was just under 54 years old, with the oldest healer being 83 years old. What's interesting is that the average healer in Rotuma was actually older than the average life expectancy for people living in this area. And so it means that these healers are the real long-lived people within their community. It also means that they are in jeopardy of being lost because they have exceeded the average life expectancy. When we asked Rotuman healers about the process of becoming a healer, there were several issues that were constantly brought up that were clearly part of the pattern. The first is lineage. The lineage is really important. What family you come from really determines what kind of treatment specialties and power to be a healer are available to you. Individuals had to be empathetic towards others in order to be a healer. And they had to have a strong desire to help other people and to make the world a better place. All of these features were critical for someone to become a healer. Training was really important. If an individual just suddenly announced that they were a healer and it was unclear whether they had been trained, nobody would accept them as such. Individuals needed to have really good training in order to be recognized as a healer in the community. Finally, after a period of training, the senior healer who was training the apprentice would go through a ceremony called soro. And in this ceremony, they would pass on the power to heal to the next individual. And for many of these healers, the power to practice a particular set of remedies could only be held by one person. So when the senior healer passed that power on to the apprentice then had the power to heal, and the senior healer no longer did. This is kind of an unusual feature that I haven't found in other Polynesian communities. but was clearly practiced by some Rotuman traditions. When I ask healers about the origin of treatments, quite often they would indicate that either these have been passed down to them through lots of generations of ancestors and they didn't really know where they came from, or that they had come from other islanders who had visited and taught people how to do a particular remedy. Frequently the statement would be that a particular remedy was learned through a dream. Now most healers, if you ask them, would say they hadn't really learned any remedies through a dream, or maybe they had learned one remedy through a dream, but they would say that ultimately that's where the information had come from, was that some distant ancestor of theirs had learned a particular treatment through a dream. In a few cases, healers showed me ways that either they or their immediate ancestors had experimented, and this was apparently particularly true in the 1800s when introduced diseases were spreading through the islands and killing lots of people, and the healers had to try and experiment with new treatments in order to find ways to heal people. And in most of these experiments, they followed really logical patterns where they would determine that a new disease that they had encountered was similar to an old disease, so they would try the remedy that was useful in the old disease and then make modifications from there. So this is not a random experimentations, but it's really a logically guided experimentation process that's very scientific in nature. When we think about the loss of treatment efficacy and why a treatment might not work, the explanation that healers would give for why a particular treatment might not work was, first of all, that it was used inappropriately, meaning that the person who applied the remedy didn't do it correctly, or that they didn't really have the spiritual power to do what they were doing, or maybe there was something wrong with their own spiritual life and therefore it messed up the remedy. Greed or deception was another reason cited for why a remedy might not work. A healer might be hungry for money and therefore their remedies wouldn't work, or they might actually be lying to the patient and not telling them the truth, or the patient might be lying to the healer and therefore the remedy doesn't work. And so there was opportunities for deception to happen. In some cases, a remedy might not work because an ancestor was not happy with the healer or with the patient, or with both of them, and the ancestor was intervening in the healing process and blocking the efficacy from taking place. And finally, the remedy might not be effective because the healer who was attempting to use it had never actually received the power. Within a Rotuman perspective, the plants are not really the source of the efficacy in a remedy. It's the spiritual power that comes through the healer and goes out through the plants that mediates the treatment. So if an individual has never received the spiritual power or authority to use a remedy, it probably won't work. This is the top 10 list of indications or kinds of categories of remedies that were used by Rotuman healers. And what you see is that different kinds of infections are really prominent in this. Rotuman healers have lots of different kinds of remedies that clearly treat kinds of infections, particularly bacterial skin infections. Second most commonly, we see inflammation and the related category of fevers. And they have quite a number of plants that are clearly used in ways that are anti-inflammatory. As you go down this list, you'll see that most of these types of treatments are things that can happen on the surface of the skin. And in fact, this is consistent with the way that the plants are used. They're applied externally, massaged into the skin. Rotumans use well over 100 species of plants within their treatments. I want to go through just a few examples of treatments in order to give you an idea of some of the different kinds. The first and most common kind we have is just kind of a common treatment. These are remedies that are used by everyday people. They don't necessarily need to be a healer, although healers can use these remedies as well. When a healer does use a common remedy, that remedy is reckoned to be much more effective than when a non-healer uses it. So an example of this is the use of oi rau rau, the leaves of which are crushed and squeezed into a minor cut in order to stop bleeding from occurring. We also have some kinds of treatments that are used only by specialists, and these can be simple or complex treatments as well. An example of a simple treatment used by a professional healer includes the one shown here for the treatment of stonefish poisoning. There's only one plant used, and it's the sap of this particular species that's used, and it's just simply daubed onto the area where the stonefish poison has entered. Healers may use a simple extraction. The example given here of the use of ngia, this is the leaves of this tree are placed in coconut oil and then soaked in that oil. After a while, the leaves are taken out of the oil and tossed away, and then that coconut oil is applied to skin irritations and reactions that might occur. And so in this case, presumably something has been extracted out of the leaves of the tree and is in the coconut oil as it's applied. The third kind of specialist treatment is actually the most common, and this is a compound extraction or a production that involves the use of multiple plants. This could involve the extraction of fluids from these plants, sometimes referred to as the blood of the plants or the juice of the plants. It could involve the mixing of the plants, pounding them together, pulverizing them. It could involve extracting them in water or coconut oil or other kinds of liquids, and then mixing all of these together in a particular fashion. The remedy that's illustrated here happens to involve 4 plants and 6 different plant parts. And once this is all mixed together, it's both massaged externally on the body and taken internally as a treatment to promote menstruation. In addition to learning about the medicinal system, I had the opportunity while I was on Rotuma to try to better understand the disease classification system. And this includes the ways in which people would diagnose a particular disease and then place that disease within a large classification system. In addition, I got a chance to visit each of the islands within the group and was able to collect the plants, so I was able to learn about the flora of the islands and also the adjacent atolls that are nearby. So there's a few key points that I think we can learn from the Rotuman medicinal system. First is that medicinal traditions involving the usage of plants may not recognize the plants as having specific powers to heal. And so it's important to try to understand exactly what it is that people think causes healing. In the case of Rotumans, it's the spiritual power of the healer transmitted to them or through them from either God or from their ancestors who is the source of healing, and not the plant. The second, when pharmacological actions are recognized, they're still secondary to spiritual, social, dietary, and other experiential actions carried out by healers, patients, and others involved. And so it's rather inappropriate to trivialize a medicinal system by trying to reduce its efficacy to the pharmacological actions that can be recognized by external scientists. Finally, a hallmark of Rotuman healers is that they practice their traditions as a part of a genuine desire to help people in the community and to help the community be better off. And they have a strong and an eager willingness to share with others in order to see better health care. And I think this is probably consistent with the ancient traditions, and it's a model that I wish more modern medical practitioners could emulate, of having a sincere desire to see health rather than a sincere desire to see financial gain.